Is anybody familiar with this campaign or image? No? Awesome, okay. So about 6 years ago, IBM launched a new kind of corporate strategic initiative called Smarter Planet. And this is some of the work that came out of that. The premise was that IBM wanted to kind of harness the intelligence of the world or kind of connected data within companies. And it resulted in a pretty big boost, I think, to IBM's kind of brand position or image. So kind of long been known for having kind of a stale kind of communication strategy, big blue. This kind of campaign, this is kind of very attention grabbing, it was youthful, nice big bold colors, strong shapes, and just kind of an overall design aesthetic that was really well done. And also it was really minimalistic, modern, and kind of harkened back to Paul Rand's work that he had done for IBM in the 50s, and then even with some of his poster designs in the 70s and 80s. And then out of that also came things like this kind of system of iconography that they had created for all the different kinds of like branches of the kind of campaign. Well, at the same time, internally, when I was working at IBM, they kind of sent this down as a corporate initiative to say, how are you guys then going to incorporate this kind of new strategy or campaign tagline, kind of rebrand into the work that you're doing? And so there was a lot of confusion, as you might imagine, and I had buddies that were doing things like grabbing these icons, ripping out the color palettes from that, and then sort of just applying that to the product design that they were doing, kind of in an attempt to align themselves with this kind of strategic initiative. And you may have seen something like this in your companies before, but it really raised the question, how are UXers in particular supposed to take what was sort of these lofty ideas of this campaign or kind of initiative and then apply that to the kind of work that they were doing? The short answer was very few people knew how to do that. Fast forward a couple years now, I work kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum in an interactive agency that's now working with big brands. So I get a chance to work with places like IBM and Lenovo, ESPN, Dick's Sporting Goods, Conservation International. So these kind of big brands. And so this is kind of a collection of the things that I've been handed over the past year from these companies. So this is the kind of documentation that I tend to see from them. So brand guidelines, kind of corporate strategic initiatives. You can see awesome Venn diagrams like this where apparently your brand idea is somewhere in between what's special about you and what the world needs. So good luck, translating that into something meaningful. But as kind of a result of that, we get a lot of fluff, right? And then we have to kind of figure out what to do with those things. But what it's really taught me in the last couple of years is there's just this really big gap between UX and branding. So many UX teams just don't know how to acknowledge, or they really just don't understand the role that, or how to communicate kind of the brand to their audience. And a lot of times they just question, why do they even need to be doing that at all? So I kind of came up with these 3 scenarios that I have seen over the past couple of years that sort of describe this relationship. This is kind of the one I encounter the most. I call it passing the buck. So the idea here is that it's just somebody else's responsibility to handle the brand work. And I think there's a couple reasons that UXers typically kind of have this mentality. One is depending on kind of the level or degree of your visual proficiency or how comfortable you feel there, you just don't feel that it's part of kind of your conversation. Or if you equate branding to visual design, then you kind of just don't really think it's part of something that you need to do. A lot of times people just feel that marketing goals, brand goals are not really aligned with user goals, and therefore there's kind of that conflict. And then I think as we have gotten more specialized as user experience designers, there's more of a tendency to say then it's got to be somebody else's responsibility because somebody else has to sort of be more specialized in that. But kind of whatever the reason, this kind of mentality of passing the buck onto somebody else really creates a problem. And one of those problems, or the main problem, is by passing it, we sort of give up the opportunity or the chance that we have to actually impact how the brand is understood in a meaningful way. Second scenario that I see is call it kind of this look-alike. So in this scenario, design teams do want to have some sort of acknowledgement of the kind of brand goals in their work, but they don't really know how to do it. So as a result of that, what you tend to see is just kind of looking around, what's the latest campaign or what's the latest product design that we kind of put out, and then just sort of like blindly grabbing some elements and copywriting or color palettes that those things have, and then sort of just applying it to the work that you're doing. And the idea is that, well, if we just kind of make it consistent, then we're doing okay. So that kind of like brand consistency. The problem with that kind of mentality, though, is that, again, it sort of equates branding to a purely visual, kind of a pure visual process, and then a lot of times it's just misusing or misappropriating elements. In this last scenario is to see a good amount at a place like Viget. So we have a lot of clients that come in. A lot of the interactive projects or work that we're doing are frequently seen in conjunction with a larger rebrand effort. And as a result of that, depending on what the client wants, a lot of times they have one kind of consultant that's doing the brand and kind of campaign work, and then we're brought in as an interactive team. And so what ends up happening is these things have to happen concurrently. So as our design team is working through IA and content strategy, interaction design, and then on the visual design, there's another vendor handling kind of the brand and strategy work. But a lot of times the way that work is made, they don't want to share that work until it's kind of fully baked, and they create sort of like this godlike brand document, and then that finally gets thrown over the fence to us. And then we're having trouble about how we're going to apply that. So it ends up being this problem where we're kind of interpreting a style guide and trying to apply it after it. So there's really three kind of observations here. What I've discovered is many UXers just misunderstand the role that branding plays. They don't see how it applies directly to the work that they're doing. And as a result of kind of teams being spread across organizations, those sort of brand principles are not being shared. So for the rest of the talk, I'm hoping to change that perception and see how we can make these observations be seen differently. So I kind of want to go through a really compressed kind of 5-minute understanding of kind of the history of branding, which I know in itself seems kind of crazy, but just to give some context there. I want to take you through a couple case studies that think of companies that are doing, I think, a good job of this, and then take you through a couple lessons that we can take back. So between companies and consumers, there's kind of this communication space. So pre-1950s, if you think about branding, it primarily consisted of just a simple mark on a product or a symbol that represented a product. The purpose of that mark was generally to kind of show the creator or the source of that particular company. Literally, it had its ties into livestock branding. So the idea is you've got some sheep and I've got some sheep, and if they ever kind of intermingle, we can separate them out and we know who's who. So we know the owner. Gradually, you can imagine that morphed into products like ceramics or watches. So that kind of brand mark was put on there. So pre-1950s, it's mostly, it is 100% visual. But it primarily surrounds or centers around this idea that the brand mark is there for ownership or to indicate a source, materiality, sort of like the localization of that product. Post-World War II, so after 1950, there's several kind of factors that have altered then how companies have to communicate with consumers. The first is mass production. So we're just as you're able to have factories in different places and your processes to create those products are more efficient, that changes sort of the game in terms of the kinds of products that are being created. Mass transportation is another kind of factor. So now because you're able to ship those products either by plane or increased thoroughfares, then the product reach that you have is no longer local. So it is increased in kind of its scope in that way. Mass communication, so now besides just print ads, you have the ability for radio and television to get across or to communicate kind of a message of your particular brand. And then lastly, people just had a ton more money to spend and they wanted to kind of spend it. So what this kind of created was this diluted, kind of unlocalized market. And so if you can imagine, dish detergent A and dish detergent B, Now the processes to create those are almost identical. They're probably made out of the same kind of materials. They do the same kind of thing. They can now be made in Michigan, another can be made in California, but they can be sold in Texas. So because you have this kind of diluted market now, a simple brand mark was not enough in that kind of pre-1950 scenario to separate or to distinguish your product from another one. So they kind of had to create these new communication strategies to break through sort of the sameness of the market. And as a result, sort of advertising was born, and but you're still seeing, for the most part, kind of unidirectional communication. So the brand is just, or the company is communicating directly to the consumer. So now you enter post-internet age, and technology has again sort of like dramatically changed or shifted this kind of space between a company and a consumer. So with the rise of social channels, there's just a lot more means for communication or avenues for communication. The creation of off and online interactions, which are also now even being merged, where both of those are kind of happening simultaneously. You have direct communication, so now you can get online, you can chat directly with a representative of a particular company within kind of seconds, so that channel is opened up. Forums, support, kind of websites are there. And then we have instant accessibility to other people's experiences with a particular company. So where, again, if you think about that 1950 model, I would have had to sort of been in the same location as that product. I would have had to have bumped into somebody who also had that product, and then we would have had to share kind of our experience with it. Now you can just get online and you can read any number of things about how someone has done that. So businesses are communicating to consumers, but now consumers are able to more directly influence how those companies are communicating to them. So if you kind of look at a kind of summarization here, so that kind of localized business to consumer, very kind of static, passive communication is now being replaced with a much more broad, global types of communication, businesses to customers, customers back to businesses, customers to customers, and then what was instead of sort of that passive, static means of communication, now you have much more dynamic, interactive communication that is occurring that gets to be much more experiential. So what it started as this kind of simple mark that was just meant to distinguish or kind of one product from another in terms of its creator or source, is now blossomed into this pretty large ecosystem of these connected experiences and services. And so when you take a kind of a survey of what people are saying about that in kind of the brand and marketing land, this is a quote from Seth Godin. So he talks about brand as this euphemism for all these other things besides just a simple message. Steve Sammartino from the Startup blog, talks about brand being related to the sort of memory of an experience that you have through an interaction. Brian Solis of the Altimeter Group coined this phrase around branding of experience architecture, that's sort of the future that we're in. And then lastly, Rick Wise of Lippencourt talks about the success of companies is going to be in their ability to craft these kind of holistic, total customer experiences. So when you kind of look back at the diagram here and rethink how that might look in a more kind of summarized way, it's really about this creation of this customized personal experience between a company and a consumer. So it's this shared kind of unfragmented experience that consumers kind of want to be able to consume in many different ways. So a logical question then is, whose responsibility is it to design this experience? So if you think back to the 1950s, or even prior to that, it was the actual creator of the product. In the 1950s, talking about an agency, so likely an art director, copywriter, an account manager, they were sort of the ones responsible for defining that message and then forcing that to be sent through the company. But today, when you start looking at the number of disciplines that can touch this, you're talking about everything from product design to customer service to industrial design to UX, service design. All of these kind of groups are responsible for helping shape that. Because if you think about crafting the entire kind of experience, if that's really where we are in terms of brand, or that we need to define the experience architecture, that's got to go beyond just sort of a simple messaging being dictated by what would typically be seen as kind of a singular creative group. So it includes kind of all these touch points. So you start putting some faces to this, and now we're talking about copywriters and art directors. They are still certainly a huge part of defining and even possibly creating the initial strategy for a brand, but social media managers, industrial designers, marketing analysts, customer support specialists, and even UX designers are then part of this kind of model as well. So next few minutes we'll want to is go through kind of some examples of companies that I think are doing that pretty well. So the first example I want to go through is Airbnb. So if you're not familiar with them, they provide the means for people to host or rent lodging, kind of in the vein of a peer-to-peer network. So they're long noted for having a really great user experience design. I think a lot of that is because their founders come from a marketing, design, and user experience background. And recently they made some waves with their kind of overall approach to their brand prior to the logo design. So I'm not going to talk about that. But prior to that, there was a lot of discussions about what they were going to do with the business. So there was some questions on, what's next for you guys? How are you going to kind of expand the business? And a lot of people thought they were going to do that laterally. So right now they're having peer-to-peer sort of network around lodging. Those questions where you're going to extend that to automobiles. So can we, share automobiles in big cities or power tools or something like that? And they said, no, that's actually not what we want to be defined by. That's not our brand. What our brand really is about is hospitality. And kind of the pivotal point for them coming to that decision is they brought in, have you guys heard of the Snow White project? Did anybody heard of this? Okay, so founder was watching Snow White and understood sort of the background of how Disney created that movie, and he got into this idea of storyboarding. So he hired a Pixar animator to come in, and they storyboarded out the entire sort of trip experience of a user. So this is everything from you just, having an idea in your head that you want to go somewhere, all the way through booking it, to actually getting out of the cab and then realizing where am I going to go now, or how am I going to get to my location, to the actual experience of the lodging, all the way back home. And so they kind of got that out, and they whittled that down. They kept editing over weeks to 30 key touch points or frames within the total sort of like customer journey or the experience of a trip. And what that revealed to them was there was a gap between what how they wanted to be perceived and communicate their brand in terms of hospitality and the experience that they were actually creating. So doing those storyboards helped them do that. So they hired a guy named Chip Conley who had run a bunch of boutique hotels around the globe. He was retired. They brought him back out of retirement and said, we want you to be the head of our global hospitality division that they created. And so as a result of that, now they've created endless amounts of documentation around kind of hospitality standards, hospitality tactics, and all of this kind of this experience that they have. And they've even gone as far as trying to train people in how to be better hosts, because that fits sort of their new brand model. And then even in the product design, so they have an open policy of we want to improve our product and we're willing to listen to any kind of idea that you bring. But the first question to ask is, how does it improve one of those 30 touch points that we have? So if it doesn't improve one of those, then it's not going to increase or benefit sort of the brand experience that they're trying to create. So it's a great example of a company that could have just been seen as a company that was a booking application, actually shifting that into kind of a really personal customer experience company. The second case study I want to go through is Urban Outfitters. If you're not familiar with them, they kind of are a home goods and fashion or clothing retailer. And I really like them as a case study because in an industry, the fashion industry, which is generally declining or has not been seen as doing very well in the last couple of years, they've actually increased their profit margins and their sales. And I think they're prominently doing this because they really know their audience really well. So their audience is primarily early adopters, so people who want to be kind of at the forefront of technology or fashion and kind of home goods. And as a result of that, then they model their kind of product line after that. So instead of having kind of a more narrow focused set of products that they have a lot of, so that's available to many, many people, they have a very, very, very broad product offering, but a very shallow number of those products. So it increases this idea of exclusivity with this particular audience. It generates a high demand for it, and it kind of limits the amount of availability that they have. So they state in their mission that they want to be a voyage of discovery for their customers. And as a result of that, the entire experience that they create around their company kind of reflects that. So some of the things they do, in the upper right, you see one of the images of a store they have. They don't have kind of a set guideline for every store. So in every city across the globe, wherever you see an Urban Outfitters, the store is a reflection of the community, the demographic, the needs of that particular group of people, and it even affects kind of the products that they have in the store. So if you were to go to a variety of them across the globe, in itself, just going into one is going to sort of be a new kind of discovery for you. They also, even in their product line, the catalog that they have online is different than the catalog they have, or what they have in the store is different than their print catalog. So again, each one of those avenues becomes this sort of voyage of discovery. And then even in the left here, the kind of branding that they do, specifically visually, the logo type treatment changes frequently, again, to reflect this idea of like newness, or sort of you're coming to a new place of discovery. And then this also even translates into their product design and even their technology decisions. So there's an app that they have that is specifically around this idea of voyage of discovery. So you take the app in store, interactions that you have with products and kind of goals, things that they outline in the app within the store. By socializing those, by completing those, you get reward points, and then you get to use those for to buy products. And then even on the other end of the spectrum, in technology decisions, a couple years ago they changed their recommendation engine that they used. Now they use a product called Baynote. And the reason that they chose Baynote was because they thought that it mapped best to their wisdom of the crowd approach to recommendations. So the idea that this particular audience frequently shares kind of recommendations with each other, so they wanted a recommendation engine that would model that sort of behavior. And as a result of doing that, now they have 1 out of every 4 customers that go online clicks on a recommendation, which is extremely high in e-com industry. And then they also have increased their online sales based on recommendations from 1% to 7%. So in about 90 days, the technology decision that they made to use Baynote kind of paid off. And the kicker to all this is they use 0 money on marketing and advertising. They spend all their money on the creation of these sort of experiences, either in the store or these apps that they create. So it kind of magnifies that. And then what it does is the experience is the brand is the experience, and that becomes their sole marketing tool. So the last example is Warby Parker. So if you're not familiar with them, they're an online retailer that sells prescription and sunglass eyewear online. And so in 2010, they kind of flipped the eyewear industry on its head by saying that you're getting ripped off by these sort of other eyewear companies. They're charging you about 400% more than what you should be paying, and we're here to remedy that kind of problem. So their primary customer connection from the outset was sort of positioning themselves as a customer service business that also sells products. And specifically, they've accomplished that by really taking the hyper-personalized kind of experience that you have in a store looking at eyewear and translating that online. So they've invested in kind of really intuitive and innovative tools to help you do that. So they have tools to help you measure pupillary distance, which is necessary if you're going to buy eyewear. They have a virtual try-on tool, so you can dump a bunch of glasses in, try those on, scale them appropriately, rotate them. Really, really well done. And then they encourage you to share those out. So kind of mimicking the idea of taking a friend with you to the store and then sharing that out and trying to see and get other people's opinion on the kinds of glasses that would look good. And then it even extends to the home try-on program. So you select a bunch of glasses, you get it in this nice box that has these divisions, which would be similar to a tray that you'd be given if you were at an eyewear brick and mortar store. And then again, they have instructions on how you would kind of translate or share that out. But one of the things they do really well is pretty cool. They created a YouTube channel that is primarily centers around very personal communication back to you as a consumer. So you might have had a customer support call with them, and about 10 minutes later, you'll get an email with a link, and that'll take you to the YouTube channel where the person that you just spoke to will actually call you out by name and give you about a 10 or 15 second video that's a follow-up on the call that you have. They do the same thing with their kind of social channels. So if you tweet at them or Facebook, it's a way for them to sort of to communicate back. So if you think back at those diagrams and you talk about that gap between a company and a consumer, they've done a really good job of like kind of closing that pretty tightly. And it's a good example of a brand that's defined by the customer service that they offer. So there's this sort of merger of the experience that they've created in this customer service that they've offered. So one in now with kind of 4 UX lessons that I think we can take back. So we talked about some common scenarios that I think exist in this relationship between brand and UX. Talked a little bit about the history of branding. Looked at a couple case studies. So here are kind of 4 lessons that I think we can take. So the first is finding common ground. So too often I hear that there's kind of like no place for brand goals and UX, and it's just not sort of a responsibility that we have. Kind of highlighting that pass the buck idea that I demonstrated before. And I read this in an article the other day. I'm not going to tell you who wrote it, but it said, the brand is an important part of the company's identity, but it is entirely separate from the UX designer's job. The user will experience it, but the purpose of the brand has nothing to do with the user's goals, only the company's goals, therefore not UX. So it's sort of this problem where there's an understanding that the user is going to experience the brand, but then the idea that it's just not part of a UXer's job to be considering that. And I recognize it's only one voice. I'm not pulling the quote out of context, but I'm not giving you the rest of the context. But it is sort of indicative of this that passing the buck mentality or some things I've seen. But I'd like to suggest there's actually more common ground between branding and marketing goals and user experience. So in 1960, Jerome McCarthy penned these kind of 4 Ps, which are kind of what's seen as the 4 touch points. So product, price, placement, promotion. And this was typically how brands were instructed to or companies were instructed to communicate their message. And admittedly, it kind of created this artificial layer between the product and the consumer, how it was communicated. But I don't actually think this model, I think it's a model that we think still exists or we sort of have in our mind might be happening, but what I've seen is much more talk, much more kind of dialogue that has shifted from this idea of touch points between a product or a company and a consumer into what's being seen as outcomes. So impression, interaction, responsiveness, resilience are typically seen as the way that marketing and brand kind of groups are trying to communicate to their audience. So the idea of impression, so does the service or product meet my needs is a question that they ask. Interaction, is this product or service doing what it says it does when I'm interacting with it? Responsiveness, is the service or product approachable? Is it accessible? Is it, again, listening to my needs for what I have? And then lastly, resilience, does the service or product care about me? Does it care about others? Does it care about some greater sort of cause? So if this is truly what marketing and brand groups are sort of some of the goals that they have, I would kind of argue that all those questions that I just outlined are questions that we would oftentimes ask as user experience designers, and therefore there's a much tighter common ground, or that becomes a points of conversation that we can have with each other. The second lesson I want to go through is this idea of becoming the glue. So think about successful companies and sort of how they kind of communicate their products or their companies. A lot of times it's at this intersection of branding, technology, business, and kind of human kind of needs. And so you think about companies like Ben & Jerry's or Burt's Bees, Apple, they sort of do a really good job of making those kind of insights kind of available and using that to sort of kind of communicate. Well, a lot of times the problem is that the insights within the companies, most companies are coming from siloed teams. So brand insights, human insights, technology insights are handled by different groups. They don't often communicate with one another, and they're fairly siloed. and obviously, I can't kind of solve that kind of problem here, but what I can suggest is if you think about the groups that we interact with as user experience designers, so users and technologists and designers and business development teams and marketing teams, we're sitting at those kind of intersections of those insights. The problem is we just have to kind of make those things sticky. So at Viget, one of the kind of common things we talk about as user experience designers internally is this idea of us being Sherpas. So how do we sort of guide other teams through sort of the terrain of a project? And when you kind of apply that to the same kind of way that we would address branding and kind of marketing goals, there's a couple of things I think we can do. I think we need to kind of get out of our own silos and start to go and interview these other teams. So start talking to people who are doing and defining marketing goals and brand goals for your companies. I think we could even use things that we have, such as personas and other means to document those goals, to identify UX needs that they have, or moments in which we can kind of help them create those plans. And finally, we can kind of facilitate those meetings among the people. An example I give is when we recently did some work at ESPN, we had a contact there, and she was really amazing at being able to bring in people from almost every kind of department that was at ESPN, so editorial and technologists and their marketing teams. And by her sort of being that glue and bringing all those companies together, it did a really amazing job. They were able to start talking to one another, understand their needs more, and then it allowed us to go in and identify opportunities that we could kind of help them out. So it's a lesson I think I've kind of had a hard time learning. The faster that we stop sort of waiting for that mandate to come down and someone to kind of give us that kind of plan, and we're the ones responsible for bringing those teams together and finding those kind of common points, then the better I think our experiences are going to end up being. The third lesson I want to take is this idea of getting macro. So I think we do a lot of micro, we're really good at micro design. So even at the tiniest scale, so understanding how users interact with buttons or gestures, that kind of design. We're also pretty good at even micro projects within a company. So designing a campaign site for a company, or designing a mobile app for a bank, or even doing usability testing within on a kind of legacy kind of product. But if we're thinking about designing kind of the total brand experience, then we've got to kind of back out of that micro and we kind of view, and we have to start considering how these decisions are seen in kind of the larger brand ecosystem. And one example of this I think is really well, this is from Tom Schneider. He's the VP of UX at Rosetta, and he crafted these ideas around brand experience metaphors. And these are kind of some diagrams or metaphors that he creates. And the idea here is that UX can actually help in brand communication planning by mapping common user experiences through these sort of metaphors, and then looking for brand opportunities, but kind of rooting them in this context of brand metaphors or experience metaphors. So this is an example of a company who creates medicine for an adult that has a kind of bladder control problem. So he starts at the core of the metaphor is this idea of a parent who needs to, is watching their kids and kind of spectating, but there's like not a bathroom kind of near there. So that's the kind of metaphor of the situation that they might find themselves in. And then from that, he then starts to think about other metaphors that are similar. So that might be being in a movie, or being on a long car ride, or going out on a dinner date, similar kind of uncomfortable situations. And once he has those larger metaphors, he's then able to look for these sort of opportunities for how you could communicate the value of this product. So that might be things like refreshment stands, or movie ticket sales, outdoor media, that type of thing. So what he's looking at is brand intersections that are both aid the customer experience, but also then reinforce the brand's value. So that sort of combination. And then once he does that, he takes it into a more traditional sort of like customer journey map, where we look at a user and how they might go from being unaware of a product all the way through conversion, and then finally being an evangelist for the product. So he's taken a task that was, for the most part, absent of any kind of UX or user real input. It was mostly just done by brand teams that were planning, weren't really taking kind of the user into consideration. And he's placed it in sort of a meaningful context now. And so it's a good example of just planning or rooting brand planning into sort of a meaningful customer experience journey. And so the last lesson I want to leave with is this idea of embracing the X and D of UXD. So I think if we're being honest, we kind of look at the landscape of the dialogue a lot of times around user experience design right now. There's a lot of discussions, hyper-focused kind of on the processes and the technology that we use, a lot of debates about methodologies. And while those are, I'm not saying the discussions are necessarily bad, but sometimes I wonder if we seem to be more worried about how we're getting to a solution rather than actually evaluating the quality of the solution that we're creating. So I've kind of wondered if we have lost sort of that spirit that many of us had when we wanted to do user experience design, which is to root this in actual experiences. So has anybody seen this Simon Sinek's Golden Circle? Have you watched this TED Talk? Yeah, so it's great. So the premise, is the idea that most companies communicate from the outside of the circle in. So they start by, here's what we do, then here's how we do it, and then they finally get around to telling you why they do it. But he discovered that most successful companies actually start with the inverse. So they go from the center of the circle out. They start with the why. And what he says is people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And then he supports this theory by demonstrating that the part of the brain that's responsible for decision making or behavior change is motivated by the why. So if you think about it, if we start with the what and the how, more often than none, by the time you get somebody to that point, they don't care anymore. If you actually hook them or you engage them through the why, you have a much higher percentage of a chance that you're going to change their behavior or influence them in some way, which does get back to this idea of the experience that we create. So, the challenge I think we have is starting our projects more with asking why. And, not to be controversial, but if the why then results in us saying that we should use an agile UX process, then great. If the why results in us doing lean UX, great. If it results in us designing in the browser, great. But let's make those decisions not because there's industry dialogue saying that we should be doing it, but that is rooted in the actual why of the product that we're making. So kind of in summary, so the first thing, finding common ground. So UX marketing and brand goals, I'd like to say that they're actually more aligned and that there's a common ground there between it. If we can start to think about those things like resilience, responsiveness, kind of interaction. Becoming the glue, let's use our sort of unique position at the intersection of all of these different company insights, these silos that are there, to start pulling those teams together and creating and crafting kind of more holistic experience. Let's get macro, so understand our role within the kind of larger brand ecosystem, or understand what we're doing as a result of that. Understand how what we're doing is more tied to the larger brand ecosystem. And then embracing the X and D of UXD like we just talked about. So kind of close out, I think this is the image I think many of us conjure up when we're thinking about sort of like the role of or strategy around branding and kind of marketing. And I'm not saying that this still doesn't happen. I'm not saying there's not necessarily a place for this kind of role or kind of attitude. But I do think we have to move past it based on this idea that companies need and see their brand being tied to the experience that they're creating for their customers or their users. I also don't want you to leave thinking that I'm standing up here saying that I think that UX design is, or UXers are the new kind of brand leaders. But I would like to challenge us to start considering how the role that we're playing is affecting the kinds of brand and marketing decisions that are made, or more importantly, how we can create more meaningful and honest brand messaging and experiences. So with that, thanks. I'll put these online.